Helen Thompson thought she knew her husband. For 30 years, Richard Thompson was the quiet, reliable man by her side, until a forgotten cell phone revealed his secret life with Melanie Brooks, a woman who believed he was a widower. What began as a marriage built on trust unraveled into a chilling web of lies, betrayal, and a double life hidden in plain sight. This is the story of the wife who discovered the truth, just days too late. Helen Thompson had always believed in the quiet strength of her marriage. For 30 years, she and Richard had built a life that seemed steady, predictable, and deeply rooted in mutual respect. They met in high school, fell in love during college, and were married before their mid-20s. Their small home in a peaceful New Jersey suburb had been filled with the laughter of 2 children, the familiar routines of shared breakfasts, and the occasional weekend getaway to the coast. To anyone who knew them, they were the picture of normalcy. Richard was the kind of man who rarely raised his voice. He was steady, reliable, and disciplined. He ran the finances of their small accounting business while Helen managed client communication and scheduling. Over the years, they had grown comfortable in their routines. Richard liked to read in the evenings, always with a glass of scotch in hand. Helen spent her free time gardening or catching up on home improvement shows. Their children, Lindsay and Eric, had long since moved out and started lives of their own, and Helen was quietly adjusting to the stillness of an empty nest. Though their lives weren't filled with excitement, Helen never longed for more. She felt safe with Richard, and safety, she believed, was the foundation of love. He had always been dependable. When their son needed emergency surgery as a teenager, Richard stayed by his bedside every night. When the roof needed replacing during a particularly rainy summer, Richard handled the repairs himself. He was the kind of man who took care of things, but small things began to shift once the house emptied out. At first, they were subtle. Richard started taking more trips for what he called business development, attending out-of-town conferences and industry seminars that he'd never shown interest in before. When Helen asked if she could join him, he always said the same thing. It would be boring and he'd be in meetings all day. She accepted that explanation. After all, he had earned her trust over 3 decades. Then came the strange credit card, charges, hotel stays in cities they'd never visited, dinners for 2 at expensive restaurants, even jewelry she never received. When she brought it up, Richard calmly explained everything. Meals with clients, thank you gifts for business partners, accommodations for conferences. His voice was always so level, so convincing. And Helen, not one to stir conflict, let the doubts slip away. A part of her was afraid to pull at the threads too hard. One evening she noticed he had started locking his office drawers, something he'd never done before. When she asked, he told her he was protecting sensitive client files. Again, Helen, let it go. The cracks were there, small, quiet warnings that something was not as it seemed. But 30 years of marriage teaches you to trust the person beside you, even when your instincts whisper otherwise. And so, Helen carried on, unaware that the life she believed was solid was already beginning to splinter beneath her feet. It was a Friday evening in early spring when everything changed. Richard had rushed out of the house in a hurry, claiming he needed to meet a potential client in Philadelphia for an impromptu weekend conference. His suit was freshly pressed, his suitcase packed in minutes, and he barely touched the dinner Helen had prepared. She remembered how he gave her a quick kiss on the cheek and mumbled something about traffic before disappearing down the driveway. It wasn't the first time he'd left like that, but this time, something felt different. Helen couldn't explain why. Hours later, while cleaning up the kitchen, she noticed a phone vibrating on the counter. At first, she assumed it was hers. But when she picked it up, she realized it was Richard's work phone, the one he never let anyone use. He had always been particular about it, saying it held confidential client information. Helen respected his boundaries and had never tried to access it before, but the screen was still lit up when she picked it up. A message had just come through, and the preview was impossible to ignore. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Love you. Melanie." Helen's hands trembled as she stared at the words. Her first instinct was confusion. Melanie? Love you? Was it a mistake? A wrong number? But then the screen faded and she was left holding something that felt suddenly heavy, too heavy to ignore. Her stomach tightened as curiosity overpowered hesitation. She unlocked the phone. Richard had never changed the passcode from their shared birth year and opened the message thread. What she found was a timeline of betrayal, laid out in photographs, emojis, and intimate messages stretching back over a year. Helen scrolled through conversations that revealed weekend getaways, dinner plans, inside jokes, and terms of endearment. Melanie wasn't just someone he knew, she was someone he loved, someone he had built an entire emotional life with. There were selfies of the two of them at what looked like a mountain cabin. One photo showed Richard grilling outside. Another had them sitting beside a lake, smiling as if they were newlyweds. Helen felt like she was looking at a stranger wearing her husband's face. But the most devastating detail came from a single photo's timestamp, taken over 5 years ago. This hadn't just started. This had been going on for years, silently living alongside Helen's daily life, hidden beneath the rhythms of their marriage. She tried to breathe, to steady herself, but her thoughts were spiraling. Every business trip, every unexplained charge, every subtle change in his behavior suddenly made sense. She sat at the kitchen table in silence, the phone still in her hand, as if it were evidence in a case against her own life. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the shattering realization that the man she had loved and trusted for 3 decades had been living a second life. And now, she had proof. Helen didn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the distant sound of a car passing on the street. She sat on the living room couch with Richard's phone in her lap, staring at it as though it might confess even more secrets if she waited long enough. Her mind swirled with questions, but the one that haunted her most was simple. How had he done it? How had Richard maintained this other life without her ever knowing? By morning, Helen had made a decision. She needed answers, real ones. Guessing and doubting weren't enough anymore. She searched online for a private investigator, choosing one with a discreet reputation and years of experience. When Detective Paul Rayner arrived 2 days later, Helen handed over the phone and explained everything as calmly as she could. She wanted proof. She wanted to know who Melanie Brooks really was, how long the affair had lasted, and what else Richard had been hiding. Over the next 3 weeks, Helen waited while the investigation unfolded. She tried to go about her daily life, answering calls from her daughter Lindsay, checking in with clients, grocery shopping, but nothing felt normal. Every moment was heavy with suspicion. She kept picturing Richard with Melanie, laughing in a car, holding hands on a walk, making dinner in some other kitchen. The images tormented her. When the detective finally returned with his findings, Helen braced herself. but nothing could have prepared her for what he revealed. Richard had been leading a completely separate life for over a decade. It hadn't just been an affair. It was a full-fledged double existence. Melanie Brooks lived 2 hours north in a quiet lakeside town in upstate New York. She was a part-time art teacher, divorced, and in her early 40s. She had been seeing Richard regularly, often every other weekend. The cabin in the photos was real. Richard had purchased it under a shell company name 8 years ago. Financial records showed he had been supporting Melanie financially, paying her rent for a small house, covering her utilities, and even paying for her car insurance and medical bills. There was more. Richard had created a fake company, complete, with a website, business cards, and tax documents to justify his absences. He told Melanie he was a widower, that his wife had died of cancer over 10 years ago. The investigator had even obtained photos from inside the lakeside cottage, framed pictures of Richard and Melanie together, a set of his clothes hanging in a second closet, a toothbrush in the bathroom, duplicate toiletries, favorite snacks he never kept at home with Helen. This wasn't just cheating. It was a full, second life. Parallel and hidden, crafted with care and precision. Helen stared at the photos in disbelief. Every moment she had spent with Richard over the past 10 years, every dinner, every laugh, every routine, had existed alongside a life he had built with someone else. And now the question was no longer how he did it. It was why. Helen had rehearsed the confrontation dozens of times in her head. She would wait until Richard came home, sit him down at the kitchen table, and ask him to explain the double life he'd been living. She pictured herself calm and steady, demanding answers, not tears. For days, she carried around the weight of the truth, waiting for the right moment. But before that moment could come, fate intervened. 2 days before Richard was due to return from his latest business trip, Helen received a phone call from the local hospital. Richard had collapsed at his office, a massive stroke. By the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late. He was gone. The news hit Helen like a wave crashing over her. In an instant, the man she had loved, the man who had lied to her for years, was gone forever. The confrontation she had planned would never happen. The questions she had carefully prepared would remain unanswered. Richard had taken everything with him, his lies, his reasons, his justifications, into the silence of death. The funeral was quiet, intimate. Close friends, old co-workers, and a few family members gathered at a small chapel. Helen stood beside the casket with a face that revealed nothing. She didn't cry, not in front of others. She accepted condolences with a practiced nod, listened to stories of Richard's kindness and loyalty, and thanked people for coming. Not a single person there knew what she had discovered just days before. After the service, Helen went home to an empty house and locked herself in their bedroom. She didn't speak to anyone for hours. Eventually, she turned on Richard's work phone again, and there it was, Melanie's number lighting up the screen, calling again and again. Dozens of texts followed, each one more frantic than the last. "Please, call me. I'm worried. Is everything okay?" "Why aren't you answering me?" Helen read each message slowly, one by one. Melanie had no idea what had happened. She didn't know about the stroke, the funeral, or Helen. To her, Richard had simply disappeared. But the most disturbing realization hit Helen like a punch. Melanie still believed Richard was a widower. She didn't even know Helen existed. In a moment of impulse, Helen drove north. She took the printed directions from the investigator's report and followed the winding roads to the lakeside town. When she reached the small cottage tucked away behind trees, she parked the car and just sat there, staring. Eventually, she stepped inside using the spare key the investigator had found in Richard's desk. The house was quiet and warm. Personal items filled the space. Framed photographs of Richard and Melanie smiling, a stack of board games in the living room, a handwritten note on the fridge. "Can't wait for our weekend." The life she never knew about was all around her. It was ordinary, lived in, and heartbreakingly real. Helen wandered through the rooms like a stranger in someone else's dream. She touched the fabric of the couch, opened a closet door, stared at a picture of Richard holding Melanie's hand. This had been his escape, his second home. He had died without ever giving her the truth, and now she was standing in it. Helen returned from the lakeside cottage with a heaviness that wouldn't leave her. The betrayal had already cut deep, but walking through that other home, his other life, made it feel like a wound that would never close. Still, grief has a strange way of blending with anger, and over the weeks that followed Richard's death, Helen found herself moving from heartbreak to determination. If he had built a life on lies, she would uncover every last one of them. When the time came to settle Richard's estate, Helen expected a straightforward process. Their home, their shared accounts, the business. They had built everything together over 30 years. But then the surprises began. She learned Richard had transferred large sums of money into a separate account she had never seen. He had named that account under a business alias, the same one tied to the fake company he had created for Melanie. Not only that, but records showed that just 2 months before his death, Richard had changed his will. Melanie Brooks had been named as a beneficiary. According to the document, Melanie was to receive a substantial portion of Richard's personal savings, including the deed to the lakeside cabin. Helen's name was barely mentioned, an oversight that felt deliberate. The betrayal wasn't over, even in death. Stunned, Helen consulted with an attorney. There were irregularities in the new will's filing, especially given that it was signed without a notary or witnesses beyond a questionable business partner. The attorney advised her to challenge it in probate court. What followed was a legal battle that stretched on for months. Melanie finally learned the truth through lawyers, not through Richard, who had taken the lie with him to the grave. She was devastated, confused, and angry, not only at Richard but at Helen, too, though they had never met. Her grief was real, her love genuine. She had believed in him just as Helen once had. Now they were both victims of the same man's deception, caught in the fallout of secrets built over a decade. In court, Helen remained composed. She provided financial records, testimony from the private investigator, and even printed text messages. The judge, sympathetic but firm, ruled in Helen's favor. The amended will was declared invalid due to improper execution. Helen retained ownership of the house, the business, and the majority of the estate. The cabin, though, was a different story. Helen chose to relinquish it. She couldn't bear the thought of owning the place where Richard had played house with another woman. It felt toxic, a monument to lies. In the end, Helen didn't find closure in the courtroom or the paperwork. Closure came slowly, in quiet moments, pulling weeds in the garden, deleting Richard's name from joint accounts, answering her daughter's calls without breaking down. She never got the answers she wanted, but she had the truth. And in the EO, silence he left behind. she rebuilt her life, honestly, fully, and finally free from the shadow of someone who had never truly let her in.